SWT is a firm that contributed to the development of sustainable sites, which is a new national program that offers a framework and a certification for sustainable site design, going beyond the boundaries of what the U.S. Green Building Council's LEED rating system established for sites. Paul has been a member of the staff of SWT for a little over 2 years. He's worked on the CORTEX project since his start of his tenure there. He has a master's in landscape architecture from Louisiana State University and may lapse into a little Louisiana patois while talking to you. Paul Toenjes and CORTEX.
All right. Thank you, Jean, and thank you, everyone, for coming out. And I really won't switch into any Louisiana speak unless you really want me to. So I'm here tonight to talk about CORTEX. And as Jean mentioned, CORTEX has been, for me, almost since I started at SWT, I've been working on this project. And it's been a really interesting process. It's a big, big project for our firm. And you know, one of the things about CORTEX that I have to ask everybody right off the bat, I'm sure you've heard the name, but does anybody actually know where CORTEX is? All right, I see some hands. That's a good thing. So CORTEX is basically between Forest Park Parkway, 6440, Vandeventer on the east, and sort of Newstead Avenue on the west. But the important thing is that CORTEX is surrounded by these important institutions. So it's surrounded by WashU Med, Barnes Hospital, BJC, St. Louis University Med. There's also the Central West End and the Grove, and there's a lot in this area. And one of the things that sort of CORTEX came about was as a way to play off of these partners. There's tons of research and tons of things going on in these areas, but a lot of that leaves St. Louis. Whenever the research gets done, it goes somewhere else. And so it was founded in order to sort of take advantage of those things. And that's why it's where it is. It's a really important location for it. So the idea is this, the concept is the innovation community. I mean, that's what CORTEX is built around. So the idea is that you have these university ideas, research and so forth, that you need to capitalize on somehow. And you don't want it to necessarily move to Silicon Valley or somewhere else. There's tons and tons of research going on in these institutions. So it's a way to kind of take all of that research and apply it right there. So you create spaces for entrepreneurs, places for people to start businesses and really get going, and then they're here. They stay here, the tax base is here, and so on and so forth. And so then you develop this idea of an innovation community. So an innovation community is where you get the people to actually stay there all the time. So it's a 24/7 kind of thing where people actually live in the district, they work in the district, they have fun in the district, or maybe they go down to the Grove. But you know, in general, they hang out here, and that was one of the big challenges of the project, was how to kind of create this environment for this to happen in. So just a little background on CORTEX in general. It was founded in 2002 as this innovation district, and it has 5 partners, so WashU, St. Louis University, University of Missouri St. Louis, BJC Healthcare, and the Botanical Gardens. And so they put together an initial investment of $29 million to start CORTEX. And CORTEX is essentially, it's a TIF district. So if I were to go back to that slide, it's a TIF district in that boundary. And it's also what is, I think it's called a 353C. So it's basically its own, it governs itself, so to speak, in the city. The city has ceded governance of this area, not in terms of policing, but in terms of the ability to develop the district. So CORTEX has development rights for the whole district. And so their mission is to basically serve as this region, or this regional center for technology and innovation. And like it says at the bottom, to create a 24/7 live, work, play innovation community. I mean, that's what we were really interested in with this project. So right now there's been a lot of things going on in CORTEX, and they've accomplished a lot since their founding in 2002. These are just some of the built works that have happened. There's the Shriners Hospital, which is in the center of the image there. That's under construction right now along 6440. This building just got completed, which is right next to our central park space that I'll be talking about a little bit. And then one of the things that I find most interesting is this company right here, Cofactor Genomics, which is really a good example of what the district's trying to do. So this company was founded by a couple of former faculty members from WashU who had been involved in genomics research. They were actually involved in the original Human Genome Project. So a lot of that research was done here in St. Louis. And these guys came up with some really innovative and new ways of sequencing genes in a way that didn't make it so time-consuming and cumbersome. I think they said initially it would take a week to sequence one set of genes. And now they can do it in somewhere between 2 and 3 hours. And obviously it's all become computerized and much more, much more fluid of a process. But they bought an old building in CORTEX, retrofit it, and now that's their headquarters. So that's a really good example of what we're trying to do there. And then, of course, I have to mention, you know, the things that everybody knows about CORTEX. It's probably the things you've actually heard about. It's sort of the big blue and yellow box, and then the fact that they're getting a Metrolink station, which has been probably the most recent announcement for the district. So that's a really big part of our project, is how to create a space that can tie into that energy and then start thinking about things like, you know, sort of housing and ways to play off of that, transit-oriented development and so forth. So just looking at the sort of the scope of the projects that have happened, the yellow are completed projects or under construction projects, and the blue are projects that are already in planning. So there's a ton going on within this district boundary. I mean, this is about 200 acres, give or take, and you know, probably 50% of it is under planning or under construction. So it's a big deal. So our challenge as SWT Design, as landscape architects, our challenge was how to kind of knit this all together. So creating a central space that ties things together and a place that can get people outside and get people interacting with one another. I mean, collaboration is really the key to innovation. So you get people outside and you get people talking to one another, because a lot of times these people are held up in laboratories all the time till all hours of the night. And so you want to give them a place where they can interact, and that's the commons space. So it's about a 4-acre park that we were challenged with putting together. Park is a little bit of a misnomer, but it's a very sort of urban plaza landscape. And then dealing with Duncan and Boyle Avenues, about 8 blocks of streetscapes. And all of this is under construction right now. You can drive over there and see it. It's a mess, but so again, like I was saying, the whole idea is to create a place for innovation and creation and a place to collaborate and be inspired. So how do we get that person who spends all the time sequencing genes outside and interacting with other people who may be starting up a technology company, or who may be starting a company that does, there's a company in the CORTEX headquarters building that does nanotechnology for, they basically put little robots in your bloodstream to detect cancer and things like that. And that was a collaboration between a bunch of engineers and a bunch of these kinds of people. And had they have not met, that never would have worked out. And then how do we create an environment where they can have fun? So there's things like hackathons, this idea that, you know, a bunch of really nerdy engineering people and computer science geeks get together and come up with something really innovative. But how do we do that outside? You know, how do we create that environment for that? And then just other ways for people to collaborate. You know, put them all on a communal bicycle, put them on a funky bench, and then just come up with funky stuff, right? So in terms of design, one of the big things that we looked at, and we always look at on any project, is how to sort of take from nature and be inspired by nature. I mean, that's really the basis of what landscape architecture is. But we tend to look at things in terms of sort of natural systems. You know, we might be inspired by a mountain, or we might be inspired by a river system, things like that. But what was neat about this project is we got to be inspired by sort of the science of nature, because that's so much of what's going on in the district. So we spent a lot of time looking at really cool pictures like this to be inspired. And we actually met with some of the folks from that cofactor genomics and talked about DNA research and things like that and how that could inspire our design. So just to point out a couple of the random pictures here, this is a wasp's eye, just so you know. And this is a neural network, which is one of the things that we really were excited about. But But you start to see how those sorts of things can turn into architecture, right? So we're always being inspired by these things because they're part of us. They're part of who we are. So it's how to turn those types of things into a built environment, right? So for example, this is a little bit of, from our design process, looking at fern fronds coming up out of the ground. And then how that starts to translate into a sketch idea and then into a little bit more of a concept of a plan. Another example, sort of the neural network, like I mentioned, how that can start to turn into a landscape idea. So these are kinds of places where we started out with our advisory group, who are made up of those different partners in the organization. And we approached it like this. And what they ultimately settled on was this vision. So this is our central common space, as I mentioned, our 4-acre park. We've got the Metrolink tracks coming through here, Boyle and Duncan up here. And it's a combination of sort of passive spaces. There's a lot of, and I'll get into that, rain gardens and intensive stormwater solutions, but that give place for native plantings. And there's also a lot of very sort of structured places. We wanted to create spaces for events, for different things to happen. So in the overall vision, we sort of we broke this space up into 3 different pieces, and I won't get too much into this, but the whole idea was to think about programming, think about things we could put into these spaces. So we got into talking about things like creating outdoor office spaces, places where people could go and have a conference outdoors, and that everybody could stand around and watch them. And sort of, if you wanted to interject, why not, Put up a sign like Gene did when the last group, put up a 6-minute sign. The same thing for a meeting. You could walk up and put up a piece of paper and says, hey, think about this. But other things, just silly things like chess tables and ping pong and stuff like that. The central space, the venue, we thought of more as that would be our event space because it is the largest space on the site. So thinking about ways to program that, and also you'll see later looking at sort of pavilion structures and things that would actually facilitate events to take place in. And then the southern piece, the terrace, was thought of as more of the passive garden space. So one of the things that's probably the biggest driving factor in the whole design of this project was sort of stormwater. So we have in St. Louis, like many other old cities, we have our combined sanitary and stormwater system. And the typical way of dealing with stormwater is to put things into a pipe. And I'm guilty because this is from CORTEX. We're putting in pipe right here. But one of the things we had to do as part of this project was actually separate the sanitary and storm on the project. And that's one of the pieces, but the bigger piece was looking at sort of how we fit into the watershed. So we're part of sort of the River to Pear watershed, Shoto Greenway. Mark will talk about that. But basically we developed, and we were part of developing a district stormwater master plan. And the stormwater master plan talked about this idea that we needed to keep, and this is part of MSD's new requirements, that you need to keep the first 1.14 inches of rainwater on site. So that's something like I think it's like a 90 or 99 percentile storm event. So we had to really look at where could we put all this water. I mean, we're developing, in the district-wide, we're developing essentially 200 acres of land. So we got to put all that water somewhere. Rooftops, streetscapes, all of these things. So we were just building the backbone for some of this and hoping that we could hit a high number and they could tie in some of the buildings. And we were successful with that. And this is what the whole premise is built upon, right? How nature does it. The idea that water collects in these areas, is able to kind of infiltrate into the soil. Some of it runs off into rivers and things like that. But you keep as much as possible in place unless you have horrible Missouri clay soils, and then it's a really big challenge. So in terms of green infrastructure, that's what we talked about. We talk about there for stormwater. There's sort of 3 different strategies. One are these curbside bioretention areas that you'll see if you go right now on the southern end of Clayton, the southern end of Boyle right at Clayton. Several of these have been constructed already. but it's a vegetated area that water's allowed to go into 24 to 48 hours, water's gone. But the plants are taking up the heavy metals, the bad stuff coming off the street, and a lot of the water is just going into the soil there. Another one is using permeable pavement. I mean, we've all seen permeable pavement at this point. And then these huge, just massive scale rain gardens that really haven't been done a whole lot in the city of St. Louis. I mean, these are kind of they're not new, but one of the challenges we have is people think native plants are a little too messy looking and things like that. And so that's one of the challenges with this kind of strategy is how do you create a space that really is going to be great for sort of biodiversity and it's going to be great for stormwater, but then how do you balance out the sort of corporate, the mentality that everything needs to be green all the time and so on. So this is just some of this under construction. We built it's a 4-foot tall Core-10 steel wall. Overall, we have about 500 linear feet of this steel wall on the site. And that created the backdrop for these rain gardens. So you see the guys down here, you can see how far down they are. They're working in this pit, which is essentially where some of our special soil, the soil that's required by the sewer district for these types of applications, that's where the bulk of the infiltration is going to take place. But the whole thing is designed to hold water. So we're talking, we're basically 4 feet deep at this point. And we've had a couple rain events already where we've filled it, and this is it planted, where we've filled 3 feet deep in this space. And that's just water coming off of the adjacent parking lots, coming off the buildings nearby and the street. And that's what it's going to look like once those plants grow a little bit more. So I just want to throw that in there. And then one of the other pieces of this whole thing, so beyond the stormwater strategies, was just how to tie in fun little sort of design elements into the story and into this idea of getting people out into the space and having them be inspired by the space that they're in. So again, there's our scientist and our DNA. And one of the things we said was, well, why don't we incorporate that into some of the features on site? So for example, that starts to become a paving pattern. So this is obviously built. You can go check it out. It's not done, but it's done enough for right now. And then another piece of that was then tying in these sort of inspirational quotes, which are really hard to see right now, but just tying in these inspirational quotes and different things like that can work into, so different signage, educational signage, and things to get people really thinking about the processes that are happening here and how then they can use that as an idea when they go back into the lab, for example. Another big thing is we want all this activity to happen. We want all these people to be out here doing things. But, we always have the issue of, well, where am I going to plug in my laptop? Where am I going to plug in my phone, right? So one of the things we talked about was, well, let's put in these little power stations everywhere. We can't give people any excuses not to get outside, right? We got to make them go outside. So why not put one of these next to every bench in the project? So that's one of the things that we're doing. And then in general, just creating spaces that are comfortable and that are functional for different kinds of events. And one of the big things was creating sort of this, being inspired by that DaVinci wing idea, creating this pavilion structure, which will probably be the more iconic piece of this project when it's done. And unfortunately, this is about as far as the design is right now on it, because this kind of came in later. But this is just this large pavilion structure, but that will serve and be powered as such for music performances. It's going to have some pretty amazing lighting effects and things. And this will be in that sort of middle venue area of the Commons. So just to give you kind of a wrap up here of what the final vision we hope will look like. This is, again, what I was talking about with the stormwater management. You have this really intricate and really complex system of pipes and things going on that help to mimic these natural systems, these watersheds, and the way that water flows naturally. But we have a lot more complicated situation because we're in an urban environment, the soil's junk and all kinds of other things. But what that can create in the future is it can, start attracting nature, start attracting a great blue heron, for example. get somebody out doing some plein air painting and things like that. But really create spaces where people interact with these features and sort of these natural elements. And then the other piece is, again, innovation, innovation, innovation. Getting people out and having places where these crazy, cool, sciencey things can happen. So where somebody can bring out their pet robot and, everybody can check it out while, the butler over here is serving these people lunch. They're just they can be really inviting and really fun spaces, right? And then just the overall look again, now that you've seen some of the other pieces of it, you see how it starts to come together. So that curvy wall you saw under construction, that's right there, for example. And then future plans for the Metrolink station and potentially a bike share type facility. And Mark's going to get into talking about the trail that may or may not go through here, hopefully. But again, just creating these fun spaces for people to be outdoors and really rethinking the way that we look at interacting in terms of business and work. And then that's sort of the last hurrah there, this sort of nighttime, beautiful, invigorated space with lots going on. And that's what we're hoping it'll be. So and that's all I have. If anybody has any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, is there any plan for sort of putting some voltaic, the photovoltaic industry is getting more efficient all the time.
Sure.
So to the extent we could actually do it in St. Louis now, because the ROI is getting lower and lower all the time.
Right.
Is there a plan to do some level of photovoltaic?
There definitely is on some of the, so we've been partnered with, there's, oh yes, sorry, the question was about introducing photovoltaic, gosh, I can't even say that word. PV, yes, solar panels into the CORTEX district. And actually, as a lot of these buildings are being developed, that's one of the big things they're talking about as part of their sort of district-wide sustainability strategies. We actually looked at it for that shade structure, which I showed a little while ago. We looked at a photovoltaic fabric, but unfortunately, it's not quite there in terms of design.
Give it 18 months.
Yeah, I know. That's what we need 18 months. But that's one of the things we talked about too for that. So, any other questions? Way back.
It must have been right in the middle of your planning that we got the Tiger grant to help fund the new metro station there. That's right on the edge of CORTEX, right? Did that affect your planning at all?
It did, and fortunately, our client CORTEX. So that's sort of the idea of where the Metrolink station would be. So you see right here, and that's more or less the location that they've settled on right now. But our client has always had their fingers crossed that would happen. So we've known about that for the duration of the project, and we've always been hoping that it would be right next to our common space. For a while, it was down further at Sarah, and then it moved back, and then it was mid-block, and they looked at a bunch of different things, then it went away for a while. So we're really happy to hear about that. So, any other questions? Yes. Sure. Well, well, can I address just the last one first, and then we'll, the question was, how do you integrate sort of rain gardens and these types of systems into historic properties, and how do you look at being that innovative when you have to deal with the other side of things where you have to be protective of a site? One of the things that I think is really interesting about rain gardens and that sort of thing is that there's really a lot of different planting strategies for them. So one of the things that tends to work really well with historic landscapes is you can actually go with a very limited and very structured plant palette. So you're not necessarily getting into you're not going to have a ton of different species. You might have a really limited plant palette, but then it starts to make it look a lot more formal. And you work on ways of creating a more formal landscape that tends to go with those historical properties. Or you go the completely other way and you say, the building is the building and it's beautiful and we'll just treat the landscape the other direction. We've done both those kinds of things on those types of projects. And then what was the beginning part of your question? Do you remember? Okay, integration with the rest of the city. Well, you know, a lot of these things, especially the sort of the curbside rain gardens and permeable pavers and things like that, can easily be done in sort of a modular way so that those can be applied throughout the city. The issue, one of the biggest issues that we found on this project is just all of the junk that's in our streets. So for the last, 150 years, utility companies have been putting things in the street however they want, really. And so a big part of our project has been just trying to find straight places to put a length of pipe. Things really simple that shouldn't be that big a deal, but they are a really, really big deal in the city. So it's really working out ways to do things on kind of a small scale because you almost have to, so that you can have things that then link together and make a bigger system. I think that's kind of the way that we have to approach it. And that's sort of what we focused on here was we were fortunate to have big landscape areas where we could treat large volumes of water, but we're really treating almost all the street in those curbside rain gardens. So that's out of the equation. We're just focused on, we're taking water off of these buildings too. So that's why we have such big areas. Sure.
Is there a budget?
We are doing it in phases. The question was, are we doing it in phases? We are doing it in phases. We actually, for example, this piece ended up out of the project. And this area up to the north here ended up out of the project because they don't really know what's happening with these buildings adjacent, but also it kind of budgetary-wise worked out a little better too. The other piece is sort of several of these architecture pieces. We are doing the shade structure, but the ultimate goal in this central space would be to do a more permanent amphitheater type structure. So some of those things were just immediately taken off the table. So this would be sort of the 2020, 2025 vision. Hopefully not that long, but it may be. Really the focus from here on out will be developing the rest of the streets in the district and treating the streetscapes the same way that we've treated Boyle and Duncan. So integrating green infrastructure, redoing curb lines. The big thing about this whole area is just making it more pedestrian friendly. Because it's just a big old warehouse district. That's all it was. And so there's 1,000 feet between the next place you can cross the street comfortably. So a lot of it was dealing with things like that, where to create crosswalks, where to create crossings, and how to make things, even ADA accessible is a big part of it too. So.
Thanks, Paul Toenjes.
All right, thank you.